this?
Yeah, there will be client-side validation. No matter how good client-side validation gets, you must always do server-side validation. That will never change, ever. Always, never rely on client-side validation. But yes, HTML5 comes with this lovely new API for client-side validation, where, let's say you got type equals email. Now, right now, if we're doing client-side validation, we need to check, does this look like an email address? Break out the regular expressions now, you've got two problems. There is actually an RFC for validating email addresses, and it's a regular expression about yay big. And there are inevitably false positives, there are inevitably false negatives. So the two problems with form validation in JavaScript is one, you have to do it twice because you have to do it on the client side and you have to do it on the server side. You have to do it on the server side. And two, bad client-side validation is worse than no client-side validation at all. Okay? So the problem with when you have to validate things like input, does this look like an email address? Yes or no, and throw an error if it doesn't, is you might get that wrong. By pushing it down the stack into the browser, you just say input type equals email. Now it's up to the browser to figure out, does this look like an email address? And browser makers are pretty smart. And also the code is now not in your JavaScript, it has to be downloaded from the web. It's sitting inside the browser, so the code can be longer, it can be more robust. Essentially you're pushing it down the stack and you're letting the browser take care of the hard work. And this is something that you'll see again and again in the evolution of the web, is that something that people had to hack around with themselves, that they had to script themselves, that they had to do procedurally, gets encoded into a pattern that gets pushed down the stack and becomes declarative. Right? So, for example, one of the first uses of JavaScript was doing mouse overs, right? Mouse over navigation, that when you use a mouse over a link, you change the background image or something, and you mouse out, you change it. That was so common that CSS introduced :hover, and now that's how you do it. And so it solves the same problem, but whereas one required scripting and needed to be procedural, the other is declarative. And declarative is always going to win over something programmatic because it's easier to author, right? And it pushes the complexity down the stack. Pushes it down the stack. So these new input types, go ahead and use them. There's a JavaScript API provided that's lovely. You can basically just say, is this valid or not? You know, there's a new attribute called required. Just put that on it and let the browser take care of making sure that all the required fields are filled in, right? Now you will probably still need to use some JavaScript for the older browsers, but like I said, you can test. You can test, do you understand the required attribute? If so, you take care of it. If not, here's some JavaScript. And then over the next few years, we can slowly start removing that JavaScript. So what's happening is all this client-side form validation is becoming declarative rather than scripted, which is a pattern you see over and over again. But yes, always, always, always validate your input on the server side. That's the other side of Postel's law, right? Be conservative in what you accept. Be conservative in what you output. Sorry, I could get Postel's law completely wrong. Liberal in what you accept.
So do you expect multi-language or polyglot HTML5 documents to come into common use?
Polyglot HTML5 documents, this is an interesting one. When people talk about polyglot HTML5 documents, this is basically something that could be simultaneously HTML and XML. Generally what they're talking about is stuff like lowercase element names, lowercase attributes, quoted, self-closing tags, stuff like that. There's actually more to it than that when you get down to the way that browsers parse XML versus the way they parse HTML. There's a whole bunch of the JavaScript APIs behind the scenes that work differently on HTML documents than they do on XML documents. So generally, when people say they want a polyglot document, that's probably not what they mean. That said, there is a separate effort at the W3C to produce a specification for polyglot markup, if you so wish. But actually, I think what you probably want is just the ability to run something through an XML parser and have it understood. There is a polyglot specification out there being worked on. And actually, if you could contribute to that, whoever asked that question, if you could check it out and contribute to it and take a look at it, that would be really, really useful.
So what about HTML5 for mobile? Is this helpful, or does it change not so much?
So these new input types I mentioned, input type equals email, input type equals URL, input type equals tel for telephone number. Mobile's fired with some really subtle, nice enhancements, which is when you tab into one of those input types, the keyboard that comes up is subtly different than it would be for input type equals text. So for input type equals email, it's got the @ symbol right there on the keyboard. For input type equals URL, it's got the .com button. For input type equals tel, it brings up the numeric keypad. Rather than, very subtle, very nice. Now, There's a whole lot more to it than that. What I haven't talked about today, because I just talked about the language side of HTML5, is the platform side of HTML5, all the APIs, all the sort of heavy lifting JavaScript stuff. Partly that's, because of time, partly because that stuff's way over my head. But a lot of it's going to be really, really useful for mobile. And probably the most useful is offline storage. That there's a cache attribute, a manifest attribute you put on your HTML to say, go to this file, and it's basically a list of other files, and download this stuff so that if we're offline, you can work with these files instead. It's like a mega cookie, right? You can store a whole bunch of stuff in there. And that, of course, is really, really, really useful for mobile, where connectivity can be sporadic. You get on a train, you go through a tunnel, right? Stuff like this, that you can continue to work on a web application even when you're offline, and then once you get a connection again, it works. So off the top of my head, I think the offline caching manifest stuff is probably the most useful stuff for mobile, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's pretty good. The fact that WebKit is becoming the kind of de facto browser for a lot of mobile devices is really good, because the WebKit support for a lot of the HTML5 stuff is great, really, really great.
Is there any HTML5 lint tool that you would recommend?
There is one. I haven't got the URL off the top of my head, but if you just search for HTML5 lint, you'll find it. It's being put together by a fellow called Marco. I think it's written in Python, fairly straightforward thing. Yeah, and it's got just different options. You tick the checkboxes, like check for quoted attributes, check for closing slashes on standalone elements, stuff like that. I'm sorry I don't have the URL on top of my head, but if you just Google HTML5 lint, you should find it pretty easily. What I'd like to see, we could start to get them pushed together with the validator as options. That would be really nice. And there's also an HTML5 outline generator, which is really nice. Do a Google search for that, which is when you start using these new section elements and articles with these H1 to H6s all the way down the stack, what kind of outline that produces. Somebody's written an outliner. So you've got lint tools, you've got outliners, you've got validators. And I think we'll start to see them come together into one lean, mean validating machine.
Important question. Will HTML5 support the blink tag?
That is a question for the CSS working group. That is presentation, and therefore belongs in the CSS working group. I wouldn't be surprised if the CSS working group did introduce the blink tag, but yeah. There's a whole bunch of presentational stuff is now gone from HTML5, so the font element is gone.